This program is brought to you by Pussy Magnets.
Put a midge on your fridge with a pussy magnet.
Welcome, my lovely lumps. Or should I say lovely labs? I'm so thrilled to have you here in the Labia Lounge. We're going to yarn about all things sexuality, womanhood, relationships, intimacy, holistic health, and everything in between. Your legs. Ooh, can't help myself. Anyway, we're going to have vag loads of real chats with real people about real shit. So buckle up, you're about to receive the sex ed that you never had and have a bloody good laugh while you're at it. Before we dive in, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. It's an absolute privilege to be living and creating dope podcast content in Naarm, and I pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, if you're ready, let's flap and do this. Oh my God, is there such thing as too many vagina jokes in the one intro? Whatever, it's my podcast. I'm leaving it in.
Don't panic, you're not broken. Your sex education was a piece of shit. Get your flaps out and pull up a couch. It's the Labia Lounge.
Hey gang, just before we jump into this episode, I wanted to offer you an opportunity to access my new mini course for free before I start charging for it in future. It's for people with vulvas and it's quick to complete. It's all about demystifying the female body and pleasure anatomy and getting some basic fundamentals to understand your body better. It's called Pussy Pleasure Secrets, Your Roadmap to Bedroom Bliss. You can grab it on the freebies page of my website or in the show notes. It's a great little free resource to kind of dip your toe in or act as a bit of a taster for my work. So if you've ever been curious about this sort of thing and you just don't know where to start, or you want a really quick, easy, accessible, non-threatening way to get the ball rolling and start working on this stuff, this is a great place to start. Hey, my labial lovers, welcome back. Today we're tackling a really massive and nuanced topic that is oh so important and really should be at the core of every child's education from the get-go, in my opinion, and that is consent culture and education. People generally don't realize how much there is to this and how deeply it affects everyone, especially those socialized as women, on a daily basis throughout the entire lifespan. And it's something that I've really started nerding out on big time over the last couple of years. So I'm excited to be chatting about it. We're going to discuss how rape culture, despite what some may argue, is still very alive and well, how it's constantly impacting us in more ways than we realize, whether you think you've been sexually assaulted or not. We'll talk about what we can do about this and how we can start to look at consent and teach ourselves and our children to start breaking the cycle of normalised consent violations and sexual violence. And we're generally just going to kind of meander around on these topics because they're quite complex, and I think just some of the things that we'll be chatting about will be things that might sort of seem really obvious as soon as you hear them and be like, oh my God, yeah, but that maybe you haven't like nutted out in your own head before, because it's kind of all hiding in plain sight. So today I've got Danielle Bezalel with me, aka DB, who's the creator, executive producer, and host of the Sex Ed with DB podcast. It's a feminist podcast bringing you all the sex ed you never got, centering LGBTQIA+ and BIPOC experts. Danielle earned a Master of Public Health with expertise in sexuality, sexual and reproductive health from Columbia University, and currently lives in Oakland, California. Welcome, DB. Thanks for coming on. Let's pull up a clit cushion.
Thank you so much for having me, Freya. I really appreciate it. Consent. I am more than thrilled to spend a long while talking about this today. So thanks again.
Yeah, no, thank you. I've been wanting to do an episode on this for absolutely ages. I was like, oh God, there's so much. Where do we begin? And I suppose I probably should have also given a bit of a trigger warning, too late now, about talking about rape culture. And I suppose just off the top to kind of set the scene, I wanted to, I guess just like acknowledge that like for most people, like in their minds, you hear the word you hear rape culture and, you just go to the very like overt, very obviously kind of malicious or premeditated or deliberate act of P&V, sexual assault that we've been taught is the definition of rape. Like we think of rape as quite a limited thing or specific act. And obviously like, a violation like this from a perpetrator who intends to cause harm in this way is one thing, and that is way more black and white to most people. Like it's like, okay, well, we know that's bad and that's fucked and that's rape. But that's only a small proportion of sexual violence and rape that actually happens overall. And so when we're talking about rape culture, I wanted to kind of, I guess, bring attention to the fact that this also includes the normalization of some far more common and insidious forms of sexual assault that really fly under the radar, because we've unconsciously signed up to go along with it or ignore it or even expect it from boys and men in particular. And it's all of this sort of less obvious stuff like, that often the perpetrators and the victims don't even realize isn't okay because it's become so normalized. So this is stuff that's happening all the time. Everywhere you look, it's stuff like normalizing microaggressions, misogynistic comments, or jokes, or catcalling. These little things that go unnoticed mostly, or just sort of are swept under the rug or like shrugged off, really create fertile ground for sexual violence and coercion to occur without it even being recognized as such by our society. So I was wondering if like you had some examples of this sort of thing that you teach that most people wouldn't even consider as non-consensual, but that does stem from this rape culture, things involving coercion or pressure or, sex under the influence, or what are some things that you kind of draw people's attention to that are a product of rape culture and that are actually non-consensual, that are happening and are quite normalized?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that comes to mind for me, because I studied film and media at UC Berkeley for my undergrad degree, and I've always been really, really passionate about the way in which that culture and media shape kind of how we act as individuals, as people in relationships, in friendships, in sexual situations. And so, yeah, it's just so apparent that the amount of films and TV shows that have these messages in them, right? Of like, oh, this woman specifically wants to be like pushed up against the wall without asking, or like, kissed without, any sort of conversation about like any sexual encounter beforehand. And actually, I'm watching for the first time the show 6 Feet Under, which is a show that's from the early 2000s on HBO. It is about a family that is pretty dysfunctional, but really, has an interesting story behind them. They run a funeral home together. And there was literally a scene where one of the women in the show, Claire, who's the daughter, kind of the main daughter in the show of this family, she's like hooking up with this guy. And he actually is asking her, what do you like? And I was like, oh my gosh, we're seeing actually in 2003 a very good example of a cis straight man asking this woman what she wants. And she actually is the one in the show saying, I don't want to talk about it. It makes it much, much less sexy. And he asks her, he goes, well, how am I supposed to know what to do if I don't ask? Like, I was blown away by how different this depiction was, but nevertheless, it becomes, fraught because of this woman character, which is a rare kind of, depiction, because typically it is the other way around. But then he asks her, do you like your nipples played with? And she says, not if you talk about it. And then she kind of like storms off, and she's like, maybe it's best if I go home. And he's like, okay, then go home. Like, I don't know what to tell you. So it's just like, it was a wild scene that I was like, I clocked it and was just like, this is just one small example of shows that are very popular at the time. Millions of people were tuning into that show, right? And millions of people have tuned in since. And this is just an example of this idea that it is quote unquote unsexy or inappropriate or weird to talk about what we want in the bedroom, what we want from a sexual partner. And, these messages are unfortunately not few and far between. They are the norm. And so I think like media is like a whole topic where we could really talk for hours about the messages that we get around consent and rape culture.
Oh my God, big time. It's one of the main sources of influence, really, like especially growing up as teenagers. You don't have a lot to go off. It's definitely not being provided by your sex education in schools or whatever, and generally not from your parents. So we model what we see, and what we're seeing a lot of, mostly the relationships or the sexual dynamics we see are on the screen, because we're not really in the bedroom with many other real people. Um, and yeah, it just absolutely breaks my heart, because that sounds like it's almost like they kind of tried to show you how it could be done, and the really sort of open communication piece and stuff. But then, yeah, they completely sabotaged that and ruined it by the woman being like, because I hate that is such a common trope now. It's like, oh, it's not, it ruins the mood. It's not smooth. It's not sexy. Don't talk in sex. Like it kind of like harshes the vibe. There's nothing romantic about like, and that's just so not true, but it is a common trope in the media. And it's so sad that this guy was actually
Yeah.
doing a great job and like, no notes, pal, good job.
Right.
But
Right.
then, the woman couldn't even field that. And it's just like a bit of a tool of like, whoever wrote that script and produced that's reinforcing the exact same message, as if, all the other scenes that are a little bit more common, where the guy isn't asking any of that stuff and is just taking what he wants and going in for the kill, and not taking no for an answer, and being persistent and being kind of like a little bit like manhandly, and that's like meant to be sexy and hard, and it's like, oh my God, I just want them to take me. Like that's really reinforced a lot in scenes, generally where the man's doing that. And then for once, the man wasn't doing that, but they still reinforce the exact same message by having the female character not receive that in a
Right.
mature way. So that's pretty
Which is kind
deadly.
of like, yeah, like the ultimate takeaway there is that like it's weird to talk about it and we shouldn't do it and we shouldn't be embarrassed about it, which is a shame. And the other thing that I kind of wanted to mention, this season in at Sex Ed with DB, we did an episode about teens choking each other during sex. And there was a New York Times article about this that came out recently that was kind of like, we need to talk about this troubling trend where specifically boys and young men are kind of, again, taking cues from shows like Euphoria and kind of other examples in the media where they're just deciding to put a lot more pressure than they intend to or they should on their partner's neck. And it legitimately is dangerous. Like there is a study that was done around like brain damage that is equivalent to like when people get concussions during sports. And like the whole messaging here shouldn't be like, oh, like BDSM shouldn't happen. In fact, BDSM practitioners are averse to choking because of this and kind of recommend other examples of like breath play or other things that can kind of get you to the power dynamic that you're looking for without being dangerous. And so, and they kind of touch on this in the article, but I do wish that they talked a little bit more about it. But that's just another example where they also discuss the fact that the orgasm gap isn't decreasing, it's still the same. And yet, like choking habits are increasing. So it's not like women are getting more pleasure out of this. It's more of an example of sexism and misogyny kind of wrapped up in this idea that men get to decide the activity with a woman in this kind of context of a cis straight relationship.
Yeah, and there's sort of this like underlying pressure or expectation on men to take the lead and like know what they're doing and just go for it and be like confident lovers, and that sort of like we're told that looks like them not needing to ask for guidance or direction or feedback or consent, but just knowing what they should be doing and going for it because they're confident lovers and they're like, and that's just so misguided because, to me, like a confident lover would be someone confident to actually communicate about sex and check in and be attuned to their partner and continuously seeking, affirmation or consent around different acts that they're doing and taking different steps or escalating things in different ways. Like if you can't talk about that stuff, then you really shouldn't be having sex, in my opinion. And I know it makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable because we haven't been taught how to do it. We don't have the scaffolding. We don't have the modeling on how this can be like still like a sexy kind of beautiful experience to have those conversations and have that kind of communication as an ongoing thing, like woven throughout our intimacy. But it's just, it's part of my mission to try to like teach people to do this and teach women, because I work predominantly with women at the moment, like how to actually play ball. Like if someone's actually there willing to like have those chats and like checking in and asking for consent, don't ridicule them. Don't be like, oh my God, that's so not hot. Like I don't want to talk about it. You should just you just do the things to me. I don't care. Like go for it. I'm, like come to the party. Everyone needs to come to the party and be up for having these chats, even if they're fucking uncomfortable and confronting and a little bit awkward or a little bit like, they make you feel shy or whatever. Or even if you don't know what your answers are to like, oh, what do you like? Give it a crack. Give these conversations a crack because they need to be happening. And it's really devastating that they're not. And yeah, I was thinking about how the kind of the expectations, I guess one thing like enabling rape culture to continue to thrive is the expectations that males hold because of a conditioned sense of entitlement in the world in general, as well as entitlement over women's bodies, because that's what's been modeled, that's kind of what's rewarded. If we kind of look at the circumstances that lead to men thinking that it's okay to just kind of take without permission or do things without permission, we see that like the cultural and societal systems and narratives are really reflected in our sexual scripts that are just kind of followed by default, especially in the hetero, like mostly in the hetero world. So like an example of these narratives can be things like how boys are socialized and taught not to take no for an answer, to be assertive, to go after what you want, persistence equals success. They're also socialized to believe that their needs and desires are more important than a woman's. Like it might not seem as explicit as that. Like no one has maybe said to every boy, like your needs are more important, but those are the messages. That is the narrative that's running. And so these same narratives that help men become successful in a patriarchal capitalistic society and become CEOs and, those also bleed into how we approach sexuality and provide them with this sense of entitlement that just means there's so much kind of coercion going on and like and pressure that they might not even realize they're putting on, and the women in that situation might not even realize is not okay because it's so normal. Oh.
Yeah. I mean, we're fighting against like thousands of years of, you know what I mean? Like it's just like, I don't know. I just feel like we have this expectation that things should be so different now, like because women and queer people have like fought for their rights. But like, as we can see, at least politically in the US, I can't really speak to Australia, but in the US, like we're fighting tooth and nail to not consistently be going backwards with so many of these rights and expectations that we have around the way in which that minorities and, queer people, women are treated and BIPOC folks. And so I think like, of course, there's going to be this kind of deeply embedded horrificness of misogyny and misogynistic behavior from men because they've been rewarded for it. And that has been their, expectation for years and years and years. And so I think that it's a challenge, but one that's worth fighting for, which is to kind of, continually fight against that status quo, to continually be, if you hear a microaggression, say, hey, I don't think that's funny. Like, it may seem like not your job to continually be engaging in this fight. And in some ways it's not. And you have to kind of pick and choose when you want to use your energy to ensure that, in your own interactions that you're protecting yourself. But if you do feel like you're in a safe environment to have a constructive conversation with someone about the way in which they view the world, if it's problematic, we try to make these like little changes so that eventually we all are in better relationships, better friendships, better conversations that we have with our family, with people who might disagree with us. But it's a slow moving process.
Yeah. Big time. Hey, baby babes. Sorry to interrupt. I just had to pop my head into the lounge here and mention another virtual lounge that I'd love you to get around. It's the Labia Lounge Facebook group that I've created for listeners of the potty to mingle in. There you'll find extra bits and bobs like freebies, behind the scenes, or discounts for offerings from guests who have been interviewed on the podcast. There'll also be, hopefully, inspiring, thought-provoking conversations and support from a community of labial legends like yourself. My vision for this is that it becomes a really supportive, educational and hilarious resource for you to have more access to me and a safe space to ask questions you can't ask anywhere else. So head over to the links in the show notes or look up the Labia Lounge group in Facebook and I'll see you in there. And now, back to the episode. Yeah, totally agree. There's an amazing book called Consent Laid Bare by Chanel Contos, I think. And yeah, like I recommend it to everyone. It's an incredible book and it just sort of talks about how the most kind of common type of rapist, I think she calls them like entitled opportunists. And these sorts of people the traits in men that are socialized in that help them rise to power also mean that they often sort of tend to be committing acts of like non-consensual sex or sexual violence without realizing, because of a sense of entitlement and a lower level of empathy. And I think there's a quote, I wonder if I've written it down. There's a quote, something about how we need to make it so that empathy towards women becomes a trait that boys and men possess in a greater degree than the sense of entitlement they have over women's bodies. Because it's just this, yeah, and it's so important, like if we've got children and boys in particular, to be really onto it from the get-go, because there's like stuff that that you wouldn't even bat an eyelid in the 90s when I was growing up. You were expected to go to a family thing and like go and like kiss your uncle on the cheek or have like hugs from all your relatives. I used to feel so awkward and hate it so much. I'd like try to position myself on the opposite side of the dining table when someone new was entering the room so that I could try to get away with a bit of a wave instead of like a awkward
Strategic.
oh, we're going to have like a kiss on the cheek hug thing. And like I hated it so much. And we're doing that from like, little children like have no body autonomy. We're just kind of going in and giving them hugs and kisses without asking. And it seems very harmless and it's very normalized. But something that I've learned when doing, my research around consent is even those are little opportunities to start undoing this like socialized pattern of allowing that a lot of people who have been socialized to be women are like kind of taught from the moment they come out of the womb, like our bodies aren't totally ours. We don't always have control over what happens to them. Sometimes it's easier to just allow something to happen than to make a scene or create a fuss or to sort of assert any boundaries. Like we're kind of socialized not to have boundaries. And so, yeah, it's cool to think about the ways that you can even help like a young child start to understand sovereignty and body autonomy and respect their boundaries, before they even know the concept of boundaries, because that will just like provide a nice foundation for them moving forward as they grow up. Because I think so many, like when I was a teenager, like it begins so young, you kind of find yourself in these situations where no one's like actively forcing themselves on you, but you might go along with something that you don't really feel comfortable with, or you're not loving, or you might just, continue having sex even once it starts hurting because you kind of don't want to make a scene or interrupt the moment, or because you're putting the other person's needs before your own. Because, we've been taught that our needs are less of a priority and our pleasure is less of a priority. So there's so many like very insidious ways that consent violations are happening, and often the people who are the victims themselves don't even see it as a consent violation. And then we tend to beat ourselves up for like letting
Right.
something happen because we should have stopped it, or we should have, So it's very vicious in this way that it turns us against ourselves even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the Me Too movement has just shown us that it's every woman and like woman presenting person that
Yeah.
we know, right? Like, I don't know one person who hasn't experienced some form of sexual assault or
Mhm.
sexual harassment. I think like catcalling, I remember like being a middle schooler, like walking down the street with my friends and like people honking and yelling at us. Like it was so pervasive and gave
Mm.
such a bad feeling, but no one was like talking to me about that then. No one was really saying anything about like that's wrong and you're more powerful or whatever. There was no sort of messaging around that. I think it's just so pervasive that it's
Yeah.
in so many different forms that it's really hard to even know what to do when other people are kind of
Yeah.
enforcing that on you.
Yeah, big time. And that's it. It's like it's a culture. It's an entire culture that we're trying to recover from and unpick and unpack and sort of re reconfigure. And it's all very well to like teach, because I feel like the extent of consent education when I was in school was like teaching boys about the legal definition of consent, and like you know if someone's like younger than this age and you're older, like it was all just about the legal ramifications that could happen if you fucked up. um None of it was really about the ethical or moral considerations. It was kind of just like teaching boys not to rape. But it would be far preferable if we weren't just teaching boys not to rape, or to try to avoid being convicted for rape by telling them
Right.
what the legal ramifications are for this, that, and whatever. But actually creating a culture where like healthy communication and intimacy and boundaries and equality and empathy for others is just the baseline. And so within that kind of culture, if that's the default and that's the baseline, like violating consent would be totally unthinkable from that place. But the problem is like it is it's so easy for it to happen and to get away with it, and for everyone, like we've all just signed up to like go along with all of this because it's so pervasive. Like you said, it's everywhere, it's been around for ages. And it's not just the overt acts of dick in vag rape, it's the culture that creates such a fertile ground for violations of consent to happen and no one to do anything about it. um, and then, of course, the victim blaming aspect, where it puts the onus on the woman to not make herself too appealing to a rapist. We're brought up to feel as though it's on us to manage and protect ourselves from men's like animalistic, uncontrollable urges and desires by changing what we wear, or the route that we walk home by, or self
Hmm.
limiting in ways and being hyper vigilant in all sorts of ways. And it's just like, fuck me, like, how do we instill empathy for women into boys? Like, Like that is the main thing that needs to happen from the get-go, is like instilling empathy into boys and like knocking back some of that entitlement.
Mhm.
But we live in a fucking patriarchy, and then people like Andrew Tate and like all this incel culture and pickup artist stuff is thriving online. And I think I saw a thing where like they did a study and like boys and men are getting more conservative in their beliefs
Mm,
around this stuff. Like
that's
it's quite hard
interesting.
not to feel a bit hopeless about it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally feel you. I think like a couple thoughts. I think like for sure, like everybody should have empathy and respect towards one another and for each other's bodies and minds and hearts.
Mm.
That's kind of the baseline. Another thing that I'm thinking of is like, how do we make this cool? Right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we get media and like things that young people are watching, TikTok, like Snapchat, YouTube, like, how do we get top creators, to be on board with this kind of messaging through scripts, through films,
Mm.
through TV shows around the ways in which young boys in particular should be thinking about how to treat other people's bodies. And so, like, the baseline is there. And yet at the same time, me being like a creative person who really likes media and who really likes to kind of think outside the box, like, I do think this idea of like, how do we make this messaging cool is like a
Mhm.
valid question.
Yeah.
And like, how do we talk about these issues in a way that feels like it's getting through to young people? Like, this is kind of a separate thing, but just in terms of queer representation, right? Like the show Heartstopper on Netflix has created
Mm.
so many conversations about like what positive representation looks like for queer people across the spectrum.
Mm.
And like it doesn't do it in a way that makes it ugly or weird or strange, or it becomes a mockery of itself. Like
Mhm.
these actors are cool. Like people are looking up to them and following them on social media and interested in their stories. And like, how do we do the same thing when talking about like sex and intimacy and the way that we respond to other people's bodies? So
Yeah.
that's my one thought. And my other thought that I have is like, you know, find your people. Like you are, you listener, talking to you, you are beautiful and worthy and deserving of great sex with yourself and with a partner or partners. And if you are waiting to engage in sexual activity with someone that you're dating to see if they are also worthy of like sharing your body, that is perfectly okay. Like you do not need to feel like you have to engage in penetrative sex specifically or, hook up with someone because of any sort of outside pressure. Like know that you deserve the exact kind of experience that you want, and you should be able to trust the other person enough to feel like they are worthy of that experience. So I do think like we have to put some onus on while we're fighting, we have to put
Yeah.
some onus on ourselves to make sure that we protect ourselves and that we only engage with people who are worthy of engaging with.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Big time. And I love what you said about media, because it really is changing. There are some shows that I've been so impressed with and so blown away by, and just like, oh my God, this is so dope. I'm really, really excited that this is starting to happen. Like Sex Education or Big Mouth. Big Mouth is such a good
Mhm.
one. And it's fucking cool. It's created by like really famous, really, really talented, well known comedians. And so I see something like that and I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be the thing. Like, this is far more powerful than most things to like change the culture, because media is so big and it's sort of far reaching, and it has the power like to make things cool, like you said. Because sure, we can have programs in schools, but unless I mean, kids are switched on, and sometimes I worry, because I remember like my school journey, and there might be like a company of facilitators that would come in every now and then to try to like do like a drug and alcohol education piece, or, maybe something to do with like sex education. And you kind of just, as a teenager, you're looking at these like older folk just being like, you guys are lame. This is all lame.
Yeah.
This is boring. It's not cool to pay attention in class, let alone to actually like buy into all of this like shit that grown-ups are trying to tell us to do. So
Mhm.
you've got to be pretty freaking savvy and clever and like tapped into that younger mindset and the culture, to kind of actually get through to them and to actually make it cool. And so I think like you're so right, like TV and movies and things like that, so powerful and probably the best access point. And I just like wonder, because I watch shows that I'm like, wow, like this is incredible. It's doing such a good job of addressing all sorts of things in the realm of consent culture and sort of like, queer stuff, and like it's really impressive. But I'm like, am I just into this because I am my age and I'm a sex educator? Are
Mm.
kids also watching this? Like, are teenagers also watching this and thinking it's cool, or are they just like, like, because I guess I'm not the audience that sort of needs it the most at the moment. I'm just looking at it like, wow, this is so great. Oh my God, I love this. But I'm hoping that it's getting through the teenagers too. But it is heartening. It's heartening seeing like so many scripts and shows like really making an effort and doing a better job of this, and more diversity, more representation. Like it's awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's good. That does give me hope, actually. Thanks. I was going down a bit of a like espresso depresso vortex for a second there. Um,
Yeah.
but let's do the segment "Get Pregnant and Die" while we're talking about education in schools. Do you have a sex ed story for us?
Don't have sex, because you will get pregnant and die. Don't have sex in a missionary position. Don't have sex standing up. Just don't do it. Promise?
Yeah. One of my favorite sex ed stories is about my 7th grade health class. I grew up on Long Island in New York in the US, and, it was like a pretty like middle class, like, normal quote unquote public school. And we did have a health class, which is more than most, but really the topics that I remember going over are like drugs and alcohol and STIs. Maybe we went over like nutrition and like a couple other things, but I feel like that was the main thing. Like maybe we went over reproduction, like certainly
Mhm.
didn't go over like the anatomy of a vagina or a vulva. But we had this project where we each got assigned a different STI. And a friend of mine, Danny, at the time, she got assigned crabs. And she was like super creative and very fun. And I just remember her poster board the next like week when we had to present on them. She had this like huge trifold poster board, and she had like black yarn like all over the poster board to represent pubes. And then
God.
she had cut out these like little like paper spiders and had like put them all over the poster board. And I just remember, I mean, like I've told the story like 10 times, and it's just so funny like what sticks out in your memory almost 20 years later.
Yeah.
And I think like because we were definitely shown so many like gross close up pictures of STIs, like gross out intentionally
Yeah.
kind of moments. And
Yeah.
so I'm sure that this poster board really sticks out in my head because it was like playful and funny and like
Yes.
kind of a respite from like all of the archaicness that,
Mhm.
it felt like this sex ed class was. And I think that, more classes like need to have some levity. Like there really shouldn't be 12-year-olds that are learning only through pictures about STIs. Like we need to really be truthful with young people. And when it comes to STIs, say like, hey, like the most common symptom is no symptom at all. A lot of people get STIs. Most of them, are either curable, or if they're not curable, they are manageable with medication. You getting an STI does not mean you're not worthy of love. Like, you are perfectly great. Like, there's so many things that it would have been really easy for this teacher, who I think, did his best at the time in the early 2000s. But it's a bummer that, like,
Yeah.
those are the main things that we learned about. But very fun that I'm able to remember this fun, silly poster board.
Totally. Yeah. I love that. Go her.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Well, let's chat about why no means no isn't enough, because I think the no means no message was really drilled in and everyone's heard that. But actually, like, when you really look into it, like, no means no isn't enough. We need to make sure we're getting a fuck yes, not just a lack of a no. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that, and maybe, chat a bit about like the freeze or the fawn response, and why that kind of really means that, like, just a lack of no is not enough when it comes to consent.
Yeah, I think that, this is messaging that we've been receiving for years now. I think, like, from the beginning of this messaging, it really was like a listen to my no, right? Like, make sure that you're hearing me, or else you are raping me, like, I think it was a very kind of negative messaging, which is important. Like, people need to know that their boundaries are critical, and they need to know that they have the ability and the right to say no whenever they want. But I think that taking the message a little bit further, and to your point about, like, you need a fuck yes, and here is all of the things that are examples of what is not a fuck yes, right? Like, silence is not a fuck yes. Not sure is not a fuck yes. Being drunk and, or under the influence is not a fuck yes. You kind of being coerced into something is not a fuck yes. You kind of saying yes and then saying no is not a fuck yes. So, kind of really talking through what we're getting at here is the nuances of these interactions, and that it's really important for both parties to feel fully in control of everything that's happening in that situation. They have the ability to change their mind. And, like, let's talk about pleasure, right? Like, people typically engage in sexual interactions with other people and with themselves because they want to feel pleasure and they want to feel good. And while orgasm doesn't have to be your be all end all, and your goal, like, a lot of people really enjoy orgasming. It feels really good. It makes sense. And so, if someone is engaging in a sexual activity that is painful and, that's not something that they're wanting, if it's something that makes them uncomfortable, if they're just not in the mood, like, those are not fuck yes. Those are things that need to pause, like, have a conversation. Maybe that's it for the night, or maybe you revisit it at another time. But, like, the key here is that people deserve fun and pleasure and feeling good in their body in sexual interactions. And, I think that the last thing I'll say on this is it's really important to also discuss the nuance of how uncomfortable many of us feel in our bodies, right? And so, like, it's critical for each of us to get comfortable in our own skin and understand what feels good for us, what our boundaries are, where we like to be touched, where we don't like to be touched, what are our, red tape or red flag scenarios where we're really not interested in participating in certain acts, and how can we convey that with our partner. And I kind of mentioned this before, but, like, if you're on a first date, or if you are having sex with someone or hooking up with them for the first time, chances are they have no idea what to do, or what to do for your body that makes you feel good. So all the more reason to have open conversations, even if it's awkward, right? And if something is feeling good, convey that to your partner. Hey, that feels really good. Keep going. Or, hey, can you try this? Or, oh, that actually hurts. Let's take a pause, right? Oh, I want to try lube. There are a lot of things that you can communicate to your partner to make sure that that fuck yes is being shared, so that both of you or all of you can have a really good time and have a lot of fun.
Excuse this quick interruption. I'm shamelessly seeking reviews and 5-star ratings for the potty because, as I'm sure you've noticed by now, it's pretty fab. And the more people who get to hear it, the more people I can help with it. Reviews and ratings actually do make a big difference to this little independent podcaster. And it's really easy to just quickly show your support by taking that simple act of either leaving 5 stars for the show on Spotify, or even better, writing a written review and leaving 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts. Or if you're a real overachiever, you can do them both. That would be mad. If you're writing a review, though, just be sure to use G-rated words, because despite the fact that this is a podcast about sexuality, words like sex can be censored and your review won't make it through the gates. Lame. Anyway, I would personally recommend doing that right now while you remember, just to get on top of it and let me know you're with me on this journey. Thanks, gang. Enjoy the rest of the epi. Yeah, definitely. Definitely big time. That should be like the bare minimum kind of baseline. But yeah, unfortunately it took us long enough just to get people to take our no seriously, let alone pay attention to the sort of more subtle indications that we're not a fuck yes. And, something that I think women are women and people who are either like socialized as women or who are queer have more experience with kind of having their own sexual energy or their own desires and needs sort of bulldozed over by like a more kind of, I guess, aggressive, space-taking male sexual energy because of that kind of, entitlement. And this is like not all men, obviously, but we've all been in that position where it just feels like, okay, well, we're sort of here now and I'm not loving this anymore. I've kind of changed my mind, or like I'm willing to like go a certain way, but then I actually don't want, any genital touch, or I don't want to be penetrated or whatever. But it's just so much easier for a lot of people to kind of let it happen than to speak up. And because sometimes like, and all genders do this, I'm sure, but definitely, I mean, with my personal experience, it's happened a lot more where like the male partner has been like just a little bit pushy, and in a way that's so subtle that you're not kind of, at least when I was younger, like I didn't really think of it as like, oh, what the fuck, like as if, dude, as if you're trying to do something that I clearly am not fully on board with, like why would you want to do that? I was just kind of like, oh, I'm giving him blue balls, or like I'm kind of putting him out in some way, or I'm like withholding this thing that he is entitled to and that I am here for. So why would I not just like let him have that? And so it might even look like, um, being like, oh, actually, I don't really want to do anything below the waist. And then being like, okay, cool. Yep. No worries. And then you make out for a bit longer, and then they start to put their hands down, and then you kind of pull their hand away, and then they're like, oh, sorry. And then, 5 minutes down the track, they try again. And then eventually you're just fucking exhausted and you can't be bothered. And you're like, oh, I guess. And you just feel that like consistent, subtle pressure and end up going along with stuff. And like that kind of thing happens a lot more than, the sort of overt act of rape that we were speaking about. And the shitty thing is that like victims of sexual violence, the fact that like it's so hard to speak up or like speak out against it, and like, thank God the Me Too movement happened and it's definitely improving, but it's like, what the hell? The victims of sexual violence are referred to as brave if they come forward or if they like fight against this. And it's like, well, okay, that's pretty bizarre. That kind of indicates that like, we are obviously in a society that shames victims of violence. Because why would they be considered brave if like they weren't in a pretty like uh, negative environment to sort of speak up, like it shouldn't be considered brave. It should be the norm. It should be expected. But it's so infuriating when we are like then often like weighing up whether something that happened to us was quote unquote bad enough to make a big deal out of. And sort of trying to figure out like, oh, but did I kind of did I kind of just let that, like, was that my bad, or like, is it bad enough that it counts? You know, a lot of people are like, oh, this happened, but like it doesn't count, or it wasn't actually sexual assault. And yeah, so often the consequences of us speaking up can be more trouble than they're worth. And so, when that speaking up is a path that requires bravery to do so in the first place, it's obviously not happening as much as it needs to be. So anyway, that is just a little bit of a convoluted rant. But yeah, it's very, very tricky in the current kind of climate and in our society to say, hey, this thing wasn't okay and I wasn't down with it. Because often we're kind of not taken seriously, or we're sort of shamed, or we're blamed. And I think we have like a socialized tendency to take responsibility and accountability a little bit more than men do. So like often we're
Right.
popping that one for the team, before we would actually make a man accountable.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's important too to recognize this difference between assault and regret. And I think that like as someone who has experienced both, I just think that like it can feel like really icky to think back on certain experiences and think like, oh, I'm just going to kind of like blanket this behavior under assault. And while some of it certainly is, I think it's also okay to say like, oh, I just like really felt bad and weird about that interaction. Even if it isn't considered assault, it still could be considered like, oh, you're an asshole. Like you are a piece of trash and I don't want to associate myself with you. I know that like when I was in college and when I was in a sorority, and, definitely mixed feelings overall, like really glad I did it, met my best friends, like had a really wonderful college life. And at the same time, like when we were kind of pressured to engage with people at frat parties and hook up with people, and that was just kind of like the social norm, like there were so many times where I just wish that I didn't do that, and where I could have just erased all of that, all of those experiences, and been totally fine. Like they didn't add to my pleasure, they didn't add to my experience. They were kind of just regret. Like a lot of them were just under this regret category. And I think like it does fall under this idea of like consent / advocating for our desires and for our wants. And if we're doing that, then, and we're not getting what we want in return, like, I think it's perfectly great to be like, hey, this doesn't sound like it's going to work out. Like, I'm going to put my clothes back on and leave now.
Yeah. 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 And that's the thing, like speaking up doesn't necessarily mean, because a lot of these things, like you said, it's not like a sort of deliberate rape. It's often just because it's the blind leading the blind. The guys don't know they're doing anything wrong because of the way they've been kind of brought up and how our culture is. They've been brought up in rape culture. And then we also don't really know how to handle that. And so you don't necessarily need to like report someone anytime anything happens like that. But in those situations where it's that little bit more subtle and maybe like he doesn't know he's doing anything wrong, maybe having a conversation. And I know it's fucking hard, but like even just send a text afterwards and be like, hey, like this didn't feel comfortable for me. I felt pressured when you did this. I think you should know because it's not really cool to do that. So like, I hope you don't do it to any other women or something like that. And it sucks that like we have to be doing that community service, but like this whole
not
fucking
our
like
job again.
yeah, not our job, but like I definitely take it upon myself to do that because I feel like how else is like this sort of weaponized incompetence from men going to be shifted, because a lot of what is happening is just incompetence and they just don't know better, but they're also not being like called upon to do better, and like we're not trying to hold them to higher standards or hold them accountable as much as we should be. And it's exhausting and it's lame and it's awkward, but like I definitely try to do that wherever I see a need. And if there is a situation that happens, and even if I can't communicate it in the moment, and I wind up with like that regret that you were talking about and feeling icky and being like I never want to see him again, I'll still like send a text and be like, hey, and just explain, because you never know, like some people are just fuckheads. And some
Mhm.
people just have no idea, and they've just seen a whole lot of sex scenes in movies or porn where the man was quite like forceful and just sort of like, animalistic and choked someone maybe, or pushed them up against the wall, or just sort of like chased after a woman that had said no to them a bunch of times, but they were persistent, and in the end they got the girl and it was all happy romantic kind of ending. And it's like some people have just only got that to go off, and they're acting that out because they think it's normal. And it might just take someone whose body they have actually like, been intimate with to say, hey, that didn't feel good for me, and like I think you
Mhm.
should know. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's tricky, but it's definitely like if you can do that, I think it's really valuable to do it, because otherwise we're all just enabling this shit.
Right. And I think like another thing that I'm coming to this conversation with is I just got married like 2.5 weeks ago.
Congrats. Oh
Thank you.
wow.
And I have been with my now husband for 8 years. And so I was 23 when we started dating. And so, like, a lot of these, experiences that I had when I was like in my late teens and early 20s, like, were so mostly much worse than like
Yeah.
the kind of intimacy and sexual like expression that you have with a partner who you trust and love, and know that they have your best interests at heart, you have theirs. And
Yeah.
so like I think like while we should be able to have healthy, fun, pleasurable sex with uh, people who are not our husbands or people who we're not in relationships with, it is harder just because like you haven't had the time and energy and effort that you often have when you're with someone for an extended period of time, where like their body and what they like the back of your hand. And so I think that it is helpful to think through like, what kind of sex do I want to be having? Like, does it look like partnered sex? Does it look like I'm wanting to just really focus on myself and like give myself pleasure and not really have to deal with other people, whether that be from a place of like hurt or empowerment or both, or something in between? And like just recognizing that like random kind of one-off sex like does not have to be your reality. Like the more that you kind of engage with someone, if you are looking to kind of create that stable, consistent relationship, the more likely it is that you will get to know one another and really understand what each other likes and be able to have that respectful, fun experience.
Yeah, and just be more invested in one another's well-being and pleasure and enjoyment of the experience, like there's more skin in the game, you've got that rapport and that trust and that care. And so yeah, it's so much easier in a more sort of longer term or committed relationship context for sure. And often it just feels like more trouble than it's worth if you're, and it's been years since I've kind of had one night stands or more sort of casual sex. But when I was younger, like it often just felt like, oh, look, I'm never going to see him again anyway. So whatever, like, fuck it.
Mhm.
I'll just, cop it. Because, yeah, you're not invested and it's more trouble than it's worth to kind of put the work in. But yeah, yeah, we do what we can. I've heard so since like all this sort of consent conversation has been a little bit more in the mainstream, I've heard from men like that are really struggling with like recalibrating to the new expectations of them, and this new knowledge that like, oh god, I can't just assume everything's totally fine. um and they're worried because like they hear from a lot of women that they they want someone to initiate and just take them, and they think it's like they think being cautious or asking, like this guy in the TV show that you were talking about, asking, is this okay and what do you like, blah blah. Like some women have sort of expressed that they see that as like timid or like not hot, not confident enough, like it doesn't seem manly enough or whatever. It's all absolute fucking bullshit. But it's a thing. And these men are kind of like, oh my God, I kind of feel like I can't do anything right. Like I don't want to ruin the moment and make her think, feel turned off if I'm asking too much about consent sort of stuff. But then I also am like now completely terrified that, someone might be in a freeze response or just fawning due to prior experience, conditioning, whatever, and that they won't be able to tell if that person is, actually a no or not, or just, can't communicate properly. So it's really tricky because like they're like, I want to create a safe space, but I also, and then they're in their heads a lot, and then it's sort of creating like this interesting head fuck of a dynamic for them. And I'd love to hear if you have any like advice for, and it's kind of what we've already covered, a lot of it's just be a fucking human, like empathy,
Right.
just like admit that none of us know what we're doing and let's just be beginners about this. But yeah, I'd love to hear your take on that, because there are a lot of well-meaning men out there that are now really confused and conflicted about how to approach women, how to initiate, but still be a safe space.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things come to mind. I think that the more, you ask questions, the more likely you are to get answers to exactly what you should be doing or what the other person wants you to be doing. Now, does that mean that every 5 seconds you need to ask, like, does this feel good? Does this feel good? Does this feel good? No. But I do think that, especially when you're first interacting with somebody, it is really important to make sure that you both are on the same page, because it's very possible that you're not. So ask questions, be kind of in the moment with that person, and make sure that they feel comfortable. And another thing that I'll say is, in terms of this idea of like being manly or being aggressive, like it is perfectly acceptable for you two to be in a role play as long as you talk about that beforehand. Like if both of you kind of decide that you want it to be an aggressive situation, and there are boundaries and there is some sort of safe word or some sort of thing that you want to make sure where you're both kind of being heard if something doesn't feel right, go to town. Like you are in charge of your own experiences, and there is no rule book saying that you're not allowed to be aggressive if everyone involved is down for the aggression. So like there is room for play in those scenarios. And yeah, the final thing that I'll say is like, it's about fucking time that men are like concerned about their partner's behavior and their pleasure. Like, I think that it like good, like we all should be concerned and really be paying attention to the ways in which that we make other people feel. And this idea of like, oh well, now I can't do anything, it's like, then don't do anything. Then if that's your reaction, like a big sigh to the idea that women and people with vulvas want to be respected, then like you should go fuck yourself. Like there's no other way to explain that, right? Like, I think like it's extremely problematic to think that men who kind of have an issue with talking about consent or talking about the ways that they make other people feel, like maybe you're not ready to interact with another person sexually. Maybe you need to kind of understand like what your own boundaries are and the ways that you are unpacking your own experiences with trauma or with expectations around gender performance and those kinds of things. So yeah, about time.
About fucking time. I know. It's like it's this classic thing of like that sort of happened with the the not all men stuff. It's like, just like men, just because you don't think you're part of the problem does not mean you're part of the solution. And it also doesn't necessarily mean you're not part of the problem, because you probably are. Like, because if you're not part of the solution, then you're fucking part of the problem. Like, anyway, that was a whole lot of like me saying a bunch of similar words in different configurations.
No,
But, like,
I get it.
I think the accountability piece and like men finally taking some responsibility and like getting uncomfortable, because yes, it is fucking uncomfortable, but guess what? We've already been here for fucking millennia, guys. So yeah, it's like, it is about time. And you know, we can also approach it with I think it's maturity. Like, I think it always, like, it often seems to come back to like a lack of like emotional and sexual maturity for me. Like, when I see these people, it's almost like in other areas of their life, they're like, they've got, you know, their shit together, or they're mature in some ways, and you're like, you're a grown up, you're a grown ass man. And then you get them in the bedroom, and this is for like everyone, not just men. But yeah, people seem to be acting from this place of like teenage level maturity. And it's a shit show. And it is because we didn't get like the education. We haven't really developed that side of ourselves, and then we haven't developed the maturity or the communication skills or the comfortability in that space, because it's always been so shrouded in stigma and taboo and, you know, ignorance around the topic, which is what, you know, you and I are trying to change with our podcasts and our resources and stuff. But yeah, it's an explanation, but it's not an excuse, you know. Like, we've all just kind of got to do better. Otherwise, it's, you know, it's not going to change. And it is slowly changing, but fuck, it's slow.
Yeah.
But I'd love to fit in a little TMI story. So do you have
Sure.
a TMI for us before we wrap up?
TMI, we love it. Said TMI, we love it.
Yeah. This is just kind of a general experience, but I, in my lifetime, have tried 11 different kinds of birth control. It's just kind of a fun little tidbit. Not at once, of course, but yeah, I'm just somebody who has reacted like pretty poorly to many different forms of birth control. I've tried over like 8 different kinds of the pill since I was 16. You know, got various kinds of side effects there. I've tried the Mirena IUD. I've tried the Depo-Provera shot. I have tried the NuvaRing. And so, you know, all throughout all these different methods, basically from ages like 16 to 26, I, you know, experienced all of these kinds of side effects, from like really debilitating anxiety, like horrific, like zapping headaches, super bad acne after the Mirena. I had to go on Accutane, just like crazy reactions to all of these things. And so I think, like, with birth control, if you're listening and you have found a birth control method that works for you, that is awesome. But I think, like, we don't really talk about the ways in which, and, you know, obviously I'm a major advocate for birth control. That should go without saying, but of course I'm going to say it. Everyone deserves, in my opinion, free access to whatever kind of birth control method that works best for them. And at the same time, like, I hate the fact that my body and mind, you know, did not react well to so many different forms of birth control. And so I think that, yeah, just if you're listening and you have experienced any of these like hard symptoms when it comes to different forms of birth control, just know that you're not alone. If you've experienced like debilitating period pain and super heavy periods, you know, there's so many things that we, as people with uteruses, just kind of experience every day without talking about it, without really sharing with anyone. And just know, like, it's not gross, it's not weird, you're not alone.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's a good little takeaway, and I fully agree with all of that. I've got an episode on the pill, and, you know, its effects on the body, and I'm pretty opinionated. I also agree, like, birth control needs to be accessible, great tool, blah blah blah, all that jazz. But I'm like pretty opinionated about hormonal birth control and the sort of like methods that are really like mainstream, because I think they fuck up your body. But I've got plenty of episodes about that. So, and also absolutely no judgment for people that use them. And if it works for you, awesome. Like I fucking loved having the implant on in my arm for multiple years and was like, this is the best thing ever. But yeah, I guess I've come to a really different place with it now, like knowing what I know and being in the field that I am. But yeah, that's wild. 11 different forms. Like, fuck me, you've been on a ride.
Yeah.
That sounds awful.
And like, yeah, hormones for some people, like hormonal birth control is a godsend, and they are very lucky to be able to, skip their periods and like do all of these things that, this technology exists, and that's great. But every body is different, and you have the right to be able to experiment and try to figure out what works best for you.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, because often that's just a band-aid solution over the top of like underlying symptoms that, that we don't really get to the root cause of because it's easier to take a pill. And thank fuck that we can. Like some people, I just can't even imagine, having like debilitating endometriosis pain and things like that. So it's great that there's all these options. But I wish it wasn't just like the default that doctors chuck everyone on birth control as soon as they start getting a period, because that is not cool.
Right.
But okay, so is there anything that you feel like we've left a bit of a gap when it comes to consent stuff? Like, what would you like to leave listeners with around this topic that we haven't covered? If there is something, just to help sort of hold men and hold ourselves to a higher standard with this stuff. Hey, me again. If you'd like to support the potty and you've already given it 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening on, I want to mention that you can buy some really dope merch from the website and get yourself a Labia Lounge tote, tee, togs. Yep, you heard that right. I even have Labia Lounge bathers. Or a cute fanny pack if that'd blow your hair back. So if fashion isn't your passion, though, you can donate to my Buy Me a Coffee donation page, which is actually called Buy Me a Soy Chai Latte, because I'll be the first to admit I'm a bit of a Melbourne cafe tosser like that. And yes, that is my coffee order. You can do a once-off donation or an ongoing membership and sponsor me for as little as 3 fat ones a month. And I also offer one-on-one coaching and online courses that'll help you level up your sex life and relationship with yourself and others in a really big way. So every bit helps, because it ain't cheap to put out a sweet podcast into the world every week out of my own pocket. So I will be undyingly grateful if you support me and my biz financially in any of these ways. And if you like, I'll even give you a mental BJ with my mind from the lounge itself. Saucy. And I'll pop the links in the show notes. Thank you. Later.
We should be talking about consent and boundaries from when kids can talk through 100 years old and plus.
Yeah.
It's just a conversation that has context. And when you're talking to kids about it, it's about their bodies and about their friends and the way that they touch other people or get touched, or their body part names, or sharing, or no hitting, or things of that nature, all the way through, middle school, high school, when we're talking about sexual interactions and the way that we treat other people, and through like monogamous relationships and beyond. Like people who get married still should be, having conversations and check-ins around consent and the way that we feel about, our relationship to our bodies, ourselves and others. And so, yeah, the final thing is that like, this is an essential conversation throughout the lifespan, and we should be treating it with the utmost respect and care.
Yeah. Word. Agreed. Love your work. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I'll pop all of the links to your work and your podcast in the show notes. And yeah, highly encourage people to go and check out DB's work and listen to the potty. Just add it onto your list of epic sex ed podcasts, along with this one, hopefully. But yeah, thanks so much, DB.
Thank you. Have a good one.
And that's it, darling hearts. Thanks for stopping by the Labia Lounge. Your bum groove in the couch will be right where you left it, just waiting for you to sink back in for some more double L action next time. If you'd be a dear and subscribe, share this episode, or leave a review on iTunes, then you can pat yourself on the snatch because that's a downright act of sex-positive feminist activism, and you'd be supporting my vision to educate, empower, demystify, and destigmatize with this here podcast. I'm also always open to feedback, topic ideas that you'd love to hear covered, questions or guest suggestions, so feel free to get in touch via my website or over on Insta. You can also send me in TMI stories to be shared anonymously on the pod. My handle is FreyaGraf_the Labia Lounge, if my account hasn't been deleted for being too sex positive, which, is always a possibility with censorship. But just in case the chronic censorship finally does obliterate my social channels, I'd highly recommend going and joining my mailing list and snagging yourself some fun freebies for the trouble at www.freyagraf.com/freebies. Anyway, later, labial legends. See you next time.